I'm going to show 4 devices, and I'd like to begin by showing a clip from a speech that Mrs. Thatcher made at the beginning of the 1987 general election. In it, there are 2 consecutive contrasts, both of which get applauded.
When it is published on Tuesday, you will see that far from running out of steam, we're just coming up to full steam. As you know, Mr. President, conservative policies are not for the benefit of politicians. They are for the benefit of the people.
So that's the first of the devices, the contrast. The second of the 4 devices is something that we call the puzzle solution format. And this is based on the very simple idea that if you can say something puzzling that intrigues an audience, it'll get them wondering where you're leading. And then if you give them a good solution, you get a good response.
When I hear some of the criticisms of the treaty, I think of Don Quixote. You may remember him. He read too many old books and he got carried away fighting imaginary battles. He tilted at windmills in the belief they were giants. He saw things that weren't there. There has been a great deal of that in the current controversy over Maastricht.
The third of the techniques I want to show you, appropriately, is something which is quite well known. I call it the dreaded rule of 3, saying things in 3s. It can be 3 words, 3 phrases, 3 sentences.
You learn that they have no children in local schools. You learn that they have no relatives on YTS. You learn that they don't have a loved one waiting in pain on a National Health Service list.
So we've got contrasts, puzzle solutions, and lists of 3. You can also, and this is the 4th device I want to show you, you can also combine any of them. So you can have, for example, contrasts where the second part of the contrast is itself a list of 3. You can have lists of 3 where the 3rd item is a contrast. You can have puzzles with contrastive solutions, puzzles with 3-parted solutions. So in this next example, we have Mrs. Thatcher producing a puzzle. In fact, it's a puzzling metaphor. From the Labour Party expect the Iceberg Manifesto. And you think, Iceberg Manifesto, what's that? The solution comes in the form of a contrast. If you listen very closely, you will hear that some of the audience start to respond after the first part of the contrast. But by carrying on speaking, effectively that bottles them up, holds them at bay, until by the time she gets to the end of the second part of the contrast, it's like taking the cork off a bottle of champagne, and they'll explode for louder and longer than usual.
So from the Labour Party, expect the Iceberg Manifesto, 1/10 of its socialism visible, 9/10 beneath the surface.
A couple of nights later, we have Neil Kinnock replying directly to this, again with another combined format. The puzzle is that he appears to admit that the manifesto is like an iceberg, and you think, how could he possibly admit that? Surprise, surprise, 3 reasons.
Well, in a way, she was right. It is a bit of an iceberg manifesto. It's really cool. And it is very tough and totally unsinkable. That's our manifesto that we launched today.
All this, Max, seems very cynical, if you don't mind me saying so. Do they really sit down and go, I know, I'll have a puzzle, and then I'll have a bit of 3, and then I'll have a bit of contrast?
I think it's an interesting question, this. I think the position is that the effective communicators are people who have an instinctive feel for formulating messages in these ways. Similarly, the skilled speechwriter is somebody who instinctively writes in this way. What my experience using this information to train people with has been is that almost anybody can be taught to use them, and in a sense what one is doing is saying, here is what the naturally effective people do, why not have a go at doing it yourself? Some people, I gather, for example, Tony Benn, who I rate as an extremely effective speaker, denies that he uses techniques at all, even though one can find plenty of examples in all the speeches he ever makes.
Well, I suppose you can analyse speech-making if you like, but like taking a great oil painting and writing it entirely in terms of the chemical nature of the pigment on the canvas. Well, who cares? I mean, the point is the picture's there. And I think this attempt to analyse hand movements, pauses, pausing for effect, talking through applause. I've heard some of the stuff. I think it is rubbish. But it's not only rubbish, but it is destructive of the understanding of what is said. You can destroy understanding by over-analysis.
I think his problem is that he seems to think that what I'm saying is that if you're technically accomplished, that somehow therefore you're not being sincere and passionate. Whereas that's not at all what I'm saying. My position is that there's no point in being sincere and passionate about something if you lack the technical skill to communicate it. And there's no inconsistency between, if you like, using techniques and being passionate and sincere. And I think the best illustration I can give of that is to look at somebody using the techniques and to ask the question, really, of you and the audience, whether now you can see him using them, do you feel any less moved by the sequence? In it, you'll see the speaker using, first of all, a list of 3 with imagery about going up to a mountaintop, and then you'll see him using a mighty contrast at the end.
And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.